What was the role of oral poetry in the Jahiliyyah? What is Maruwa? What is a Qasida? What's the relationship between the Quran and poetry? Why isn't the Quran poetry? What is a Saj? What is a ghazal? What was the role that poetry, both in Arabic and in other languages, would play in the classical Islamic world after the Quran appeared? Without a doubt, the most widespread form of artistic expression in the pre-modern Islamic world was poetry. Poetry was even more commonly recited than the Quran, and in many places, this is still true today. Though in the ancient world, it was far more often recited or sung out loud, and much less often written down, poetry is the literature of Islamic civilization. The origin point of all this Islamic poetry is actually pre-Islamic. Later, Muslims would look back at the pre-Islamic late antique period as Jahiliyyah, a state or time period of ignorance. It's a disparaging term for the culture which Islam was destined to replace. Jahiliyyah suggests an age where people were ignorant of true religion and correct morals. Jahiliyyah, idiomatically, might be rendered into English as the age of heathenism or the age of barbarism. The absence of complex writing in this so-called Jahiliyyah does not mean that the Quran appeared in a time of cultural ignorance. Hardly. The world in which the Quran first appeared was a treasure trove of Arabic poetry. Some of this spoken poetry was already ancient in the 7th century. But most people would create, share, and hear new poetry regularly, sometimes daily. People would express themselves in verse instinctively. Arabic lends itself to rhyme and rhythm, pun, melody, and wordplay easily, as ancient oral languages of all sorts tend to do. Turning Arabic into various registers of poetry is absurdly simple compared to modern English. And so, when an ancient Arabic speaker wanted to express a complicated thought, such as an important history, the story of a tribe, a liturgy if the Arab was a Christian or a Jew, a prayer for the dead, or a confession of sexual love, poetry would be the standard medium. Because oral poetry did not require education, literacy, or writing tools, it spread amongst people of all strata of the ancient Arab tribal world. Rich and poor, children, men and women, and slaves all recited, sang, and created poetry. If it was particularly well done, it could survive over centuries of oral transmission to be written down in the Middle Ages. Here's one example of such a survival. This poem is attributed to someone named Safiya bint Khalid al-Bahiliya. She seems to have lived in the Jahiliyyah, but unfortunately we don't know anything about her for certain. In this short poem, she mourns the loss of a man who was either her husband or her brother, depending on how we interpret her. We were twin shoots, sprouting beautifully from a tree. When our branches spread, our shade stretched, and our buds flushed. Time snapped my other shoot. This poem is probably typical of what the 7th century Arab would have encountered or created day in or day out. Poems are short, they could be easily composed by a gifted wordsmith, and spread to people who could remember and repeat them in turn. Unfortunately, the punch of this and all other ancient poetry is lost in translation. First, the rhymes aren't represented in English. Words that resonate with meaning or subtle implication in Arabic don't necessarily carry such innuendos into other languages. For instance, The word here translated as twin shoots, racinain, employs a dual grammatical construction between the singular and the plural, and so when paired with the literal meaning of shoot or branch, it feels as though two sprouts are springing out of the same source. Less common, but more famous, were the epic poems of the Arabic oral bards, that is, professional poetry. These were much longer and more complicated, but could still be easily performed by a talented poet or anyone with a good memory. The principal form of such epic poetry was the qasida, the ode, or the poem with a certain intention. Like the shorter poem we just looked at, the qasidas were highly impressionistic. They were composed of serial bursts of sights and smells, sounds, and emotions. The poems don't give you a detailed plot, but rather suggest a general outline that the audience knew already. In a qasida, there is always a three-part structure on standard themes. First, there is a memory, typically of an abandoned campsite or a lost beloved. For instance, here is the opening of a qasida by Al-Qama, who died around the same time Muhammad was born. Is what you came to know, given in trust, kept secret? Is her bond to you broken now that she's far? Does a grown man weeping tears without end for those he loved, the dawn of parting, receive his fair reward? By the time I knew, they had set their leave. All the camel stallions standing bridled before dawn. Camel stallions of her tribe, led by maiden servants, then loaded, bundles bound in tazidi brocade. While birds hung in the air, plucked at dye streaks and tassels as if they'd been stained heart-blood crimson. They carried a citron away. A saffron-scented perfume trailed. Before the senses even now, her fragrance lingers. Like my weeping eye to a water bag dragged down the well slope by a roan mare, withers, bound to the saddle stay. Al-Qama loved someone from another tribe, to whom he confided personal secrets. But now she's gone. Has she been taken from him? Did she simply shun his advances? Was she engaged or married to someone else? Did she die? It isn't clear. But now, visiting the place where he once saw her and perhaps loved her, he catches a smell in the air, maybe lemon or saffron. As smells are wont to do, a recollection of her rises up inside of him, and so he cries for her, with his eyes dripping like a water bag being pulled up the deep well of bittersweet memories. After a memory is introduced, qasidas tell of a quest or a journey to somewhere far away, usually implying a battle. Often this too is quite emotionally mixed. Al-Qama warns of the futility of tribal fighting. Every tribe, though great, through man, will one day see its chief struck down by the hearthstones of evil. Praise can't be purchased, except for a price men begrudge, one that is well known. Generosity is a blight on riches, an abode of loss. What you hoard is left over, the object of scorn. He who gains his quarry the day of the raid finds it wherever he turns. He who misses, misses out. Hot-necked folly will cross your path. You don't have to track it down. Foresight and self-command make themselves scarce in the crowd. Whoever comes upon crows and scatters them for an omen, though secure at the time, is fated to ruin. Every fortress, long safe on great pillars, will one day be razed to the ground. Thinking about all the powerful tribal battles and once impregnable fortresses, the poet here considers how they don't last. Every great tribal chief will either die or be overthrown. Any booty won in the fight will be consumed by greed. Arrogant, violent men are fated to die young because they court trouble. and even mighty stones must someday crumble to the dust. Then finally, completing the three-part structure, Qasidas end with the display of Muruwa. Muruwa is the tribal warrior virtue of manliness and chivalry. It's the ethos of someone who is brave and who is willing to fight, kill, or die for their tribe. Muruwa is that force in young men that prompts them to ride off into battle and win honor for their people. But in the Qasidas, it's often presented ironically. Many times I have set out early against a peer, accompanied by a firm, fine-honed, piercing blade. Many times I gambled, trusting hunger to an arrow carved from hard wood, bound with sinew and notched. They put their stallions up for wager. I offer mine first. Whatever the stakes, the loser pays. I might ride well with a band of braves, no provisions, but a food sack green with mold and some stinking meat. Here in Alkama's Qasida, the poet brags about his gifts as a fighter, a bowman, and a rider who can survive in harsh conditions. Yet, this just followed the first section on the loss of one's beloved, and the second section on the uselessness of battle. So, is the poet's Muruwa a cure to his grief, or the very foolish bravado which is going to condemn him to eternal heartbrokenness and destruction? Is tribal fame and honor the way out of loss, or the cause of loss? Is this show of manliness the way he will win back his love, or is it how he lost her in the first place? It can be read either way. This culture of powerful and ubiquitous Arabic oral poetry is the world into which the Quran first appeared in the early 7th century. And the Quran is of two minds about poetry. On one hand, the Quran strongly denies that it is itself a poem, and neither is Muhammad a poet. We have not taught him the art of poetry, nor is it fitting for him. It is nothing but a reminder and a clarifying recitation so that he may warn whoever is living and that the word may be proved true against the disbelievers. To this day, Muslims typically do not refer to the Quran as poetry, even though it often has a striking, rhyming, metered language as poetry tends to do. While the Quran is a lyrical oral recital like poetry is, the Quran distances itself from poetry repeatedly and forcefully. But why? Why can't a Muslim say that the Quran is God's poetry? Why doesn't the Quran want to be considered poetry or have its prophet called a poet? The reason is that in the Jahiliyyah, poetry often carried a religious connotation that we don't consider today. In late antique Arabia, like everywhere in the pagan Mediterranean basin, poetry, and especially epic poetry, suggested some interference of a supernatural power, such as a god or a muse or a jinn. Often poets would invoke such a spirit or deity, and the poem that came out of their mouth was in essence the voice of a god or another higher power. Many poets of the Jahiliyyah were soothsayers called kahins, people who would become possessed by spiritual entities and spout out words of entrancing, perhaps magical power. Naturally, the Quran must reject such pagan ideas. No, Muhammad is not a poet, and neither is the Quran a poem. This is not the words of a spirit, but the words of the one true God. According to the Quran, poetry, as the poets of the Jahiliyyah presented it, was either shirk, association with a pagan god, or was functionally equivalent to it. Surely when it is said to them that there is no God but God, they became arrogant and said, "Are we to abandon our gods for a possessed poet?" However, since the parallel between a poet who claims to speak for a jinn and a prophet who claims to speak for God is so obvious, the Quran must actively contrast poetry and revelation for its audience. Poetry is at least nefarious, if not satanic. And besides, all of these poets who claim to be mighty warriors and lovers are full of it anyway. These poets, unlike prophets, are just boastful, bragging hypocrites. Because of this, from time to time, some later Muslims have argued that poetry is haram, forbidden according to God's Sharia. Although such opinions are rare and are typically ignored by most anyway, one can see where the arguments are coming from. And so it might make one wonder how poetry was to become such a powerful force in the future Islamic civilization, given that the Quran is apparently so opposed to poetry. While the Quran distances Muhammad from the poets and itself from poetry, we must remember that in none of these passages, or many others like them, does the Quran condemn poetry per se. Rather, it condemns becoming possessed by false divinities, or hypocrisy, and it condemns the claim that Muhammad is a poet. But poetry itself, beyond the cultural and religious assumptions of the 7th century Arab world, is simply not addressed. The Quran never just dismisses poetry generally, but rather many of the assumptions that its principal audience would have made about poetry, that it's soothsaying, pagan worship, lying, boasting, and so on. We just have to remember that the Quran is distancing itself from pagan poetry, and it's speaking to a culture in which this poetry was a key source of information, folklore, emotion, and memory. So, on the one hand, while the Quran draws a line between the poetry and itself, on the other hand, the oral Quranic recitation depends on and thrives in this oral poetic world. The Quran, too, is a heightened, beautiful Arabic. Much of the Quran's emotional and rhetorical force depends on the listener being sensitive to glorious Arabic verse. The Quran's greatest rationalization of its own authority, and probably most convincing to those who would become the first Muslims, is not any argument that it makes, but that it's orally beautiful. And so the Quran bends the audience's cultural sensitivity to Arabic poetry into its own monotheistic agenda. The Quran even employs poetic forms that the first audience would have heard before Muhammad's ministry began. Chief amongst these was the Saj. Saj is roughly a rhyming, even prose. The Saj form consists of a series of lines, all of which share the same rhyming end, sometimes to great length. Because it's quite easy to create rhymes in Arabic, the Saj may consist of dozens or hundreds of lines, which each end with the exact same sound. The word Saj suggests a galloping or a cooing, a sound that repeats itself again and again with regularity. Here, for example, is a Quranic Saj. It's a very loose English translation to show the consistent monorhyme of the Saj form. In this passage, the Arabic rhyming end is rendered into the English ing. O you in a covering, arise and give warning. Give your Lord praising, and purify your clothing. Avoid what is tainting. Do not trade favors for your longing. But for your Lord keep waiting. And when the trumpet starts blowing, that day will be trying, not easy for the disbelieving. While the Quran is not poetry or music, it's moving in a culture where beautiful, versed Arabic speech would be especially powerful. A few centuries later, the great literateur of classical Basra, Al-Jahid, would put it this way: in the days of the wicked Pharaoh and his sorcerers, God sent Moses with miracles more powerful than any magic. In the days of Greek medicine and philosophy, God sends Jesus with perfect wisdom and healing powers that could revive even the dead. And in the days of glorious Arabic poetry, God sent Muhammad with verses so miraculous that they put the poets to shame. With the arrival of the Quran and the appearance of the first Muslims, the oral Arabic tradition of poetry continued on uninterrupted, as it still does today. However, now there was a new topic for the poets to discuss: Islam. Sure, the Quran was clear that it wasn't poetry, and it had sharp words for the poets of the Jahiliyyah. But the Quran didn't forbid poetry outright, and neither did it halt the creation of new poetry. In fact, in a certain way, the Quran even encouraged the composition of poetry. It stands to reason that if beautiful, versed language is God's chosen way of expressing itself, then it must be appropriate for believing humans to return that love to God in the most beautiful language that they can muster. While the Quran was beyond poetry because God is beyond the human, a human who doesn't claim to speak for God can respond to the Quranic call with devotional poetry of their own. The standard form of such a devotion is a ghazal. A ghazal is something like a simplified version of the qasida. Perhaps most akin to the European sonnet, a ghazal is a devotional poem to a lover, an object of beauty, or, in many cases, to God. The ghazal does not have a required length or the qasida's tripartite structure, although it always uses couplets, paired verses. Generally, but not always, the poet identifies herself or himself in a self-deprecating way. "Oh, woe is me, I'm so in love and such a fool." The theme of the ghazal is always devotion in some form, be it religious, sexual, or platonic. With the spread of Islam beyond the Hijaz, the poetry of the Arabs spread with it. When the Arabs encountered non-Arabic speakers, the qasida, the saj, and the ghazal began to appear in other languages and cultures, fusing with the indigenous oral poetic forms of each linguistic group the Arabs encountered. It must be recalled that the Arabic language was, for the first Islamic centuries, still a regional language. And while some Egyptians or Syrians, Greeks, Amazi, Persians, Indians, Kurds, Turks, Sicilians, or Spaniards might have become fluent in Arabic out of curiosity about the Quran or to secure a government post, that wasn't the norm. And neither was the process of Arabization quick. Therefore, the Quran, the Sirah, and the written collections of Hadith remained the property of a few Arabic speakers, and even then only those with the means and skills to learn to read. Now, while non-Arabic speakers could learn parts of the Quran in Arabic, they wouldn't understand the words. And yet, the bulk of Islamic learning for non-Arabic speakers was to be found in poetry in one's own language, something that you could actually understand. So, if a certain Persian speaker knew the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah, they probably learned them from Persian poetry written using Arabic forms. If a Persian knew the story of Muhammad, the other prophets, or the Shiite Imams, it was because they learned Persian ghazals of devotion to them. Many of these Arabic and now vernacular Islamic poems were quite explicit about their religiosity. But much more often, Islamic poetry appears to the outsider as oddly secular. One is overwhelmingly more likely to find poems about wine, dancing, gardens, sexuality, both opposite sex and same sex, and heartbreak than sober devotions to God or theological exhortation. And in many cases, the apparent mundaneness of so much Islamic poetry is just that. A bawdy poem about a drunken love affair is just a bawdy poem about a drunken love affair. But as poetry often does, Islamic poetry, if well done, is saying several things at once. We have to note, of course, that the distinction between religious and secular is an entirely modern Western one. So, many poems composed by Muslim authors in the classical period work on multiple levels at the same time, and they dance playfully between piety and frivolity. And this makes sense, as pre-modern Islamic poetry is popular entertainment. It's for the masses. A fortunate poem ought to be able to get understood by anyone and enjoyed by everyone. But it also has to be thought-provoking enough to demand further reflection. A poem that's merely sensational or sensual will at best be a fad, but then soon get forgotten, like our own pop songs. A poem that's too cerebral or theological is a bore. But a well-crafted poem will have something to say to the sober philosopher and the drunken barfly at the same time. Here's an example of how this works. This is a short selection from the Persian poet Abu Abdullah Sa'di from his melodic collection, The Rose Garden. Sa'di recounts the tale of two lovers drowning at sea, and compares them to the famous ill-fated lovers Layla and Majnun, the Middle East equivalent of Romeo and Juliet. There was an honest and modest young man who was pledged to a fair face. I have read that they fell into a whirlpool together in the great ocean. When a sailor came to take him by the hand, lest he perish in that condition, from the midst of the waves and maelstrom he said, "Leave me and take my friend's hand." As he spoke, the waves crashed over him, and he was heard to say as he perished, "Listen not to the tale of love from that worthless one who forgets a friend in difficulty." Thus the friends lived. Listen to this worthless one that you may know, for Sa'di knows the path and custom of love as well as he knows Arabic and Baghdad. Set your hopes on the beloved you possess, and forget about all the rest of the world. If Layla's Majnun were alive, he would pen the tale of love from this notebook. So, two lovers are drowning, and along comes a sailor who reaches out to save one of them. But he tells the sailor, "Save my friend first," apparently dying in the process. But then we're told that both of the drowning men somehow survived. Then, Sa'di declares himself worthless, about as knowledgeable of the ways of love as he is in Baghdadi Arabic. Remember, he's a Persian writing in Persian. And if the famous lover Majnun wasn't dead, he would write a story just like this about his beloved Layla. And so, we could read this poem as a morality story of two lovers and the power of love to survive even death. And that would be perfectly correct. But there's more going on here. Sa'di is using coded language and suggestions that allow the knowing hearer to take this poem on another, very Islamic level. First, the name Majnun, the crazy, literally the one inhabited by a jinn, is the very same term that Muhammad himself was accused of by those who rejected the Quran. And this verse-spouting madman, this Majnun person, is in love with Layla, literally the night. Just as Majnun is an indirect reference to the Prophet, Layla is a nod to God sending down the Quran on Laylatul Qadr, the night of power. So, this well-known story of the lovers Majnun and Layla is also an allusion to the Prophet, the best lover of God and God's most beloved. As Majnun was sorrowful and driven insane because he loved Layla so much, Muhammad was tormented and called insane because he loved God so much. Likewise, Sa'di, writing in Persian, seems to be mocking himself for not knowing the tongue of the educated elite and God's chosen language, Arabic. But this too is ironic. Sa'di did know Arabic, and he even lived in Baghdad most of his life. So when we read, "Listen to this worthless one that you may know, for Sa'di knows the path and custom of love as well as he knows Arabic and Baghdad," we can take that to mean, I'm just some silly poet. But also, I am someone who knows exactly what he's talking about. Or even though this poem isn't in God's chosen Arabic language, it expresses God's message in your language. What about the two lovers drowning in the whirlpool? The storm and the raging sea are this world of suffering. We're all dying. But someone standing over the mess of this life reaches out a hand, the Prophet, and he offers deliverance from above. But it's in the form of a test. Rather than just turning one's back on other people when the going gets tough, The message of the Prophet only saves us if we serve each other. And this other can be read in two ways. It could be that the Prophet's salvation will only come if we try to help other people. Or it could be that the fair face that this young lover was pledged to was God, for, as the Quran says, all is perishing but his face. The message of Muhammad will only pull us out of the chaos of this stormy life if we love other people and love God. Thus the friends lived again in the world to come, when humanity will be reunited with each other at the resurrection, and all will be reunited with their beloved, the deity. Set your hopes on the beloved you possess, and forget all about the rest of the world. This kind of double reading is quite standard in Islamic poetry. Is such and such a poem about getting drunk or becoming intoxicated with God? Is this one poem about a rose garden or the garden of the blessed? Is this beloved human or divine? One is free to take these poems either way, making them fruitful to the spiritually sensitive while entertaining to those with more worldly interests. What was the role of oral poetry in the Jahiliyyah? What is Maruwa? What is a Qasida? What's the relationship between the Quran and poetry? Why isn't the Quran poetry? What is a Saj? What is a ghazal? What was the role that poetry, both in Arabic and in other languages, would play in the classical Islamic world after the Quran appeared?